Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Toscano, and I've been asked to moderate this panel 5 minutes ago. Which is great. I'm glad to do this job. So the title of this session is Marriage, Family, and Gender. We have three very distinguished and important scholars to talk to us. And we'll go in the order that I introduced them. So first we have Jana Riess. She's a senior columnist for Religion News Service and the author or co-author of many books, including her newly published work, The Next Mormons: How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church. Her other works include Mormonism and American Politics, Flunking Sainthood, and The Prayer Wheel: Rediscovering Prayer with an Ancient Spiritual Practice. She received her PhD in American Religious History from Columbia University and served as religion book review editor for Publishers Weekly. The title of her talk is Mormon Women Were 9 Points More Religious. So I'm going to introduce all three of them, but they will go in this order. Then after Jana, we will have Nancy Ross. Nancy is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary arts and sciences at Dixie State University. Her areas of study include the intersection of feminism, activism, and religion. She received her MA in art history at the University of St. Andrews in 2002 and her PhD in the history of art at the University of Cambridge in 2007. The title of Nancy's talk is Women and Covenants in the LDS and Community of Christ Traditions. And finally, we have Amy Hoyt. Amy is a visiting scholar at Claremont Graduate University. She is co-editing the forthcoming Rutledge Handbook of Mormonism and Gender with Taylor Petrie and has published on gender, on Mormonism, in gender and history and feminist theology. She holds a PhD from Claremont Graduate University in Women's Studies in Religion. The title of Amy's talk is Gender Within the LDS Family. So we will go in that order.
Well, by titling my talk the way I did, I kind of gave away the punchline. So if you need to leave early, Mormon women are 9 points more religious. Now you know. All right, so in giving this talk, I'm going to be drawing on data from the 2016 Next Mormons survey. We're going to quickly go through a few things: beliefs and gender, religious practices and how that breaks down by gender, and some concluding thoughts. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the Next Mormons survey, the book came out last week, and there is a more extensive methodology section at the back if you are really interested in how the sausage was made. But the basics: we had 1,156 currently identified Mormons. So that's people who on a survey will say, I am a Latter-day Saint, I am a Mormon. We had 540 people who identified as having been Mormon or a Latter-day Saint, but no longer identifying themselves as that. So the margin of error is about 3% for the larger group of currently identified Mormons. It's more than 4% for the former Mormons. Conducting a national survey that is representative of a minority population is very expensive and time-consuming and difficult, and, I'll stop there. But the expensive part was resolved because of Kickstarter, and there are many people in this room who donated in 2016 to fund this survey. If you were such a donor, would you please raise your hand? Thank you. The reason that we have independently collected nationally representative data about Mormons is because of you, so thank you. And then, as I said, the book is, well, I was going to say it's coming out in March 2019, but whoa, hello, it came out a week ago today. And I've had a couple people who've come up to me and said they've already started reading it, so thank you for doing that. That's very nice. So this would not be complete without mad props to Benjamin Knoll, who's a professor of political science at Centre College And Ben has been instrumental in every aspect of this project from the very beginning, in helping to design and implement, field the survey, and interpret the data results, which we are still doing in an ongoing effort. There's so much more data than I was able to put in this book. So Ben and I are going to be working on a book together about former Mormons who only get one chapter in this book, but will have a book of their own. So let's talk first about beliefs. How many of you have ever been in a sacrament meeting or a general conference where you've heard women called angels? Anybody? Yes, okay, so it's hard to have data about whether women are angels, but we can at least ask questions about women's religiosity to see, are they in fact more religious than men? So here I'm going to present data on two of the theological questions, a few. Belief in God and Christ, and then belief in Mormon teachings. So we have specifically Mormon teachings in one part of the survey. We have more general Christian teachings elsewhere. So here we're comparing LDS men and women on these different theological questions that you can see color-coded on the bottom. So God is real, there in the green. 83% of the women in the current Mormon sample agree with that, 69% of men. You see Jesus Christ was literally resurrected, 76% of women versus 61% of men, and on and on. When you take all of these theological questions together and aggregate them, the average difference is 9 points in theological orthodoxy. So yay women, 9 points more orthodox than men. Maybe not angels, but 9 points is nothing to sneeze at. All right, let's look at specifically LDS or Mormon beliefs. For example, the Book of Mormon is a literal historical account that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and on and on. God is an exalted person of flesh and bone. In general, the responses to the specifically Mormon questions were lower overall for all Mormons, both men and women, than the responses to the more generically Christian theological questions, which we thought was pretty interesting. And also, there's not quite as much difference here between women and men in terms of their religious orthodoxy. I should have said that this is measuring theological certainty. So on a 5-point scale, this is the top option. It doesn't mean, if people are not included in here, that they didn't necessarily believe that, but they didn't know it. They couldn't say that they were totally certain and confident. So there you go. All right, so some key takeaway points about Mormon women and religious belief. About 3/4 of currently identified Mormon women say that they are confident in general Christian doctrines. Just under 2/3 are similarly confident and know the truth of specifically LDS doctrines. Interestingly to me, the doctrines that women were least enthusiastic about came on questions about exclusion. So questions about African Americans being denied priesthood and temple blessings until 1978, or women's own exclusion from the priesthood. That does not mean that a majority of women in the Mormon sample don't support women not having the priesthood. Just want to make that clear. A majority think it's fine, but that was interesting. All right, moving on to religious practice. We're going to cover word of wisdom. See, I found a little icon of a cup of coffee. I was so proud. The practice of prayer, watching general conference, and finally attending church. So these are 4 pretty significant regular practices that Mormons are to engage in. Word of wisdom. Women, compared to men, are better keepers of the word of wisdom, more likely to adhere to it strictly. So here you can see only caffeinated soda. That's the only category in which women's consumption exceeds that of men. Does anyone here in the audience have some evidence of this right now? Yeah, okay, we've got a few. Other than that, though, you can see that men's consumption is higher than women's on all of these different things. So tobacco, it's a difference of 10 points, actually, which is very interesting. And coffee, it's a difference of about 7 points, 32 roughly to 39%. The people most likely in the survey to have been found to be drinking coffee were younger men, especially single men. Prayer and scripture study. Again, women, yay women. 70% of women say that they pray daily compared to 66% of men. And then 40% of women say they read the scriptures every day compared to 36% of men. Scripture reading was significantly lower in terms of a daily practice than prayer. So if you're in that category where you feel guilty about not reading your scriptures every day, you're actually in the majority, even among Orthodox Mormons. Watching General Conference. Again, women are stronger behaviors in this area. So 57% of women have seen any of General Conference in the last 6 months, compared to 49% of men. And the younger you are, the less likely you are to tune in. That was actually the source of the greatest difference. Only 44% of millennial Latter-day Saints said that they had seen General Conference in the last 6 months. Have you attended church in the last 30 days? So on surveys, there's often a standard question, how often do you attend church? And you can choose between weekly, maybe 1 or 2 times a month, rarely, never. However, people tend to inflate their desirable behavior on surveys. So we also added a question about actual behavior, still self-reported, but it is asking them to account for a specific recent behavior. Have you attended church in the last 30 days? 61% of women said yes, compared to 52% of men. That was interesting in that I felt like we set a pretty low bar for church attendance. The highest attenders of church were older women, and the lowest attenders, you tell me. Exactly. All right, so religious practice in summary. For the word of wisdom, we're seeing major differences on some substances, like tobacco, coffee, and alcohol, but very little on others. We didn't really talk about tea, but that was very tiny, not statistically significant difference. Almost no difference in prayer, very little, although women are a little bit ahead, 4 points. General Conference, women are 9 points more likely to watch General Conference, and 9 points more likely to have attended church in the last 30 days. So it's complicated is the brilliant takeaway conclusion, and that really describes a lot of statistical studies. It's complicated because women are more observant in some things, I would say most things, like key parts of the word of wisdom and watching General Conference, but not necessarily in all things. And that is all. We will have question time, I think, in the afternoon panel after this if you have other questions. Thank you.
Hello. The first thing that I want to do is acknowledge my co-author, Jessica Finnegan, who is not here today. But, you know, we've been putting this together. And the second thing I want to do is to thank Fiona Givens. Where is she? Is she still here? Okay. Is to thank her because she, in her comments just a few minutes ago, she referenced the temple language. She said something like, we will go down and organize, and use that as an example for the point that she was making. And in the spirit of being nerds, where's Christine? In the spirit of being nerds and talking freely about things, I want to kind of state up front that I'm going to be talking about the Law of Obedience Covenant and the way that it has changed, the way that the language of it has changed in the last 100 years. And I want to acknowledge that it is sensitive to talk about temple language. It is difficult, it's awkward, and it's challenging. And again to Fiona for breaking the ice there on that particular thing. But I also think it's important to do so. So the 2019 changes in the women's covenants throughout the temple ceremonies surprised so many people. and were quickly reported in the news, despite efforts to keep knowledge of the changes limited to temple attenders. Interested parties in various social media spaces immediately began collecting some of the specifics of the changes, with a comprehensive list appearing on Reddit pretty quickly, verified by multiple parties. The question that came to mine and Jessica's minds was, do these changes in wording reflect a new understanding of the covenants for women, or is this a further obfuscation of temple covenants to make the LDS patriarchal system more palatable to women? Jana Riess and Emily Jensen, both of whom I've seen here today, expressed similar concerns in a column for Religion News Service, and others blogged about it. To answer these questions, we turn to historical records regarding the endowment script. These are not available from the LDS Church, but are available online from other sources. Taboos surrounding the temple ceremonies prevent official publication of the scripts, and this allows the Church to change the text over time while reducing criticism for doing so, which was noted by Kathleen Flake in an article for Ritual Studies. The online sources allowed us to examine what has changed and what has stayed the same over time. There are currently no public scripts or recordings of the 2019 changes, so we had to rely on secondhand reports. There are 3 historical scripts that are publicly available, though. One from 1931, another that is often referred to as the pre-1990 ceremony, and the 1990 to 2018 ceremony. And I'm not really aware of other scripts from other times. And as women who have followed and participated in Mormon feminist discussions for more than a decade, we were aware that the pre-1990 version of the endowment, and that in that version, women made covenants to obey their husbands. However, the historical picture of the Law of Obedience covenant is more complicated than that one change. In the 1931 version, the Law of Obedience is really only referenced in a stage direction. Having laid down the Law of Obedience, sealed by oath, and made this promise, Elohim and Jehovah now ascend on the elevator. And I can only imagine that there was an elevator. So the full nature of the Law of Obedience covenant is not articulated in this early 20th century version. No oath was presented to the congregation to accept, but was perhaps implied in God's instructions to Adam and Eve before God cast them out of the garden. The other part of the covenant, the divine promise, is given in the introduction to the endowment. The men who participated in the endowment were told that they had been anointed to become kings and priests to our God. The women were then told that they have been anointed to become queens and priestesses unto your lords, that is, your husbands. And as the Law of Obedience covenant is referenced in the stage directions, it must not have been foremost in the minds of the authors of the 1931 version. There were, however, concerned with creating a hierarchical view of the afterlife using feudal language where women were cast as vassals to their husband lords. Whether this language describes a specific, literal vision of an afterlife or is more symbolic, the order and organization of the afterlife is clear. Men are promised a rank below God, and women are promised a rank below men. The usage of queen indicates that faithful LDS women will be set above other women. The promise is one of spiritual supremacy. Later versions gave specific language to the Law of Obedience covenant. The pre-1990 version of the endowment depicts God speaking first to women and leading them in making this opening covenant of the endowment. Before any further covenants were made, women first covenanted to observe and keep the law of your husbands and abide in his counsel and righteousness. Men, on the other hand, covenanted to obey the law of God and keep his commandments. The human half of the covenant-making process was clear, and it mirrored God's promises to Adam and Eve, men and women, to make men kings and priests to the Most High God, to rule and reign in the house of Israel forever. Women are promised that they will become queens and priestesses to their husbands, without a promise of ruling or reigning. In this version, women were honored with positions serving lesser gods. The phrase, law of your husbands, is particularly troubling. It parallels men's covenant to keep God's law and commandments, but again creates a hierarchy of God, husband, wife. Scripture offers a picture of what God's commandments look like, but law of your husbands is not clarified. This phrase does not appear in Scripture or in contemporary LDS texts. It seems as though keeping God's law looks like acting in accordance with God's will. Similarly, it seems as though keeping the law of husbands perhaps looks like acting in accordance with the will of one's husband. The 1990 to 2018 version replaces this language. God instructs women to observe and keep the law of the Lord and hearken to the counsel of your husband as he hearkens to the counsel of the Father. The men's covenant remains unchanged from the pre-1990 version, as does their divine blessing. Women are still promised that they will become queens and priestesses to their husbands. But hearken is a strange choice of words that in mine and Jessica's minds suggest both obedience and listening. The Oxford English Dictionary's most frequently used definitions for hearken are variations on listening, but less common definitions mean heed or to give regard to. Hearken is not a contemporary word, but one associated with Old Testament prophets. Vine's Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words notes that the most common definition of hearken is to give audience or to listen to someone, with the last definition, however, being to obey one in authority, to be obedient. The authors of this change could have had women covenant to listen to their husbands and using the language of listen, and the meaning of that would have been clear. And the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, does not list any definitions of the verb form of listen that also include the concept of obedience. Hearken, however, holds this ambiguity, meaning both listen and obey at the same time. The hearer is free to choose a meaning while feeling that the obey language of the earlier version has been supplanted with a gentler requirement. This language is altered from the previous version, but it is not clear that the intended meaning is different. The concept of obedience is still in the picture. The structure of this covenant includes the idea that husbands are supposed to hearken to God, followed by men making a covenant to obey the law of God. And within this context, it seems really that obey is the intended meaning of the word hearken. The authors of the 1990 to 2018 version gave the illusion of a less patriarchal covenant while preserving a gendered hierarchy that expects women to obey their husbands. Jessica and I are not the first person to point out this problem. Blogger Melangach discusses the semantic problem of hearken in a post for Zelophehad's Daughters, a Mormon feminist blog. Many younger women whose first temple experience was with the 1990 to 2018 version have expressed distress at hearing the hearken covenant in the endowment, myself included, documented in the When the Temple Hurts series of the Feminist Mormon Housewives blog. The three main Mormon feminist blogs, The Exponent, Feminist Mormon Housewives, and Zelophehad's Daughters, reference hearken and the problem of the hearken covenant a total of 124 times. Someone in charge of the endowment script seems to have been listening to these discussions. The 2019 version is a substantial revision of the previous two versions. And in the newest version of the endowment, men and women make the same law of obedience covenant at the same time to obey God. The change to have men and women obey God is a strong move towards gender equity. However, women are promised to become queens and priestesses with new language in the new and everlasting covenant, whereas men are promised to become kings and priests to God, as they always have. This promised blessing for women presents some further confusion. The phrase, the new and everlasting covenant, is from Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verse 6, and historically references plural marriage. Contemporary fundamentalist Mormon groups still use this phrase to indicate polygamy. The newest version removes temporal concerns about women's required obedience to their husbands, but introduces, in the words of Carolyn Pearson, the ghost of eternal polygamy. Pearson's book describes the fear and upset that many LDS women experience at the idea of plural marriage in the eternities. And in mine and Jessica's experience, the new and everlasting covenant referenced the sealing power more broadly. That's the explanation I grew up with. Official LDS Church sources describe the new and everlasting covenant as the fullness of the gospel, and encompassing all the saving ordinances, and list a number of scriptures to support this, with the last one being from D&C 132. So given the previous history with hearken, it's unnerving for the church to use a phrase that still has multiple meanings. It's also unclear what being queens and priestesses in the new and everlasting covenant actually means, with or without polygamy. This language appears to reference generic ideas of LDS salvation, exaltation, and sealing, but is still not equivalent to the men's blessing. This may be a new way of stating women's subordination in the afterlife, without using language that is clear about women's inferior status. Here, women receive different blessings from men whose eternal status is tied directly to God. However the script describes women blessings, if it's not equal to what the men get, it's likely that it really describes women's eternal submission to their husbands. This new language sounds more palatable than what came before, but does not necessarily describe a different reality in the afterlife. Only the language seems to have been changed, not the meaning. It is an intentional obfuscation of an important question. What does salvation look like for LDS women? And I believe that that is a very important question. We, the authors of this paper, have a significant amount of privilege, including educational privilege, probably similar to those who authored the 2019 changes. But for the life of you, we can't give a clear explanation of what it means to be a queen or a priestess in the new and everlasting covenant without defaulting to the patriarchal nature of older explanations. There now exists a larger gap in the clarity between the blessings that men and women receive in the endowment. Men obtain a clearly defined status and relationship to God in the afterlife, but women do not. And in an age where many hold expectations of transparency from their institutions, it is not acceptable to have a public theology of gender, which the church is generally moving to a more equitable partnership language, and a private theology of gender, where women are secondary. Whatever was intended by the phrase queens and priestesses in the everlasting covenant, it is not acceptable for the LDS Church to be clear and direct with men, and unclear and indirect with women. The lack of clarity and transparency constitute an institutional sexism that is growing and not diminishing. The church removes women's agency when it uses veiled language to reference the status of women in the eternities. They do not know what they are agreeing to. And it also, I would argue as well, calls into question the divinity of Heavenly Mother. Because if she doesn't get to rule and reign, what is that? By promoting an increasingly moderate discourse on gender in public spaces while promising a deeply patriarchal structure in the afterlife, the LDS Church has created a position for itself where it can claim moderation and greater inclusion of women while at the same time maintaining male supremacy in its private and most sacred spaces. The LDS Church maintains the endowment as an oral experience for its members with a taboo on discussing specifics or asking questions about meaning. And this has given the church a degree of control over the temple narrative. However, it is not the responsibility of women to keep the secrets of their secondary status in the afterlife, to be held by individual women as a source of private shame, as it was for myself. The public availability of temple scripts on the internet disrupts the power and facilitates a closer scrutinization of the language. The LDS Church and its women will likely continue to negotiate the language of temple covenants over time, for there will likely be future changes. A fringe of LDS women will likely continue to break the taboo and discuss private theology in public, creating further pressure for change. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm honored to be here. Within LDS theology, gender is imagined as binary, with men and women playing out different but intertwined gender roles. How do these institutionally prescribed gender norms actually get deployed within an LDS family? Today, this paper will examine how gender roles are expressed within the LDS family in North America, Botswana, and South Africa, noting similarities and distinctions between them. I will rely on the ethnographic work I conducted during 2006 and 2013 in North America of LDS women and men, alongside the oral histories and ethnographic interviews of LDS women that I helped conduct as part of a team of scholars in Botswana and South Africa in 2015 and 16. I will begin with a brief overview of historic and contemporary institutionally prescribed gender norms, and then turn to the lived religious practices surrounding gender roles in these locales. So at the heart of Latter-day Saint piety is the building of an ideal family. So much so that one of Jana's interviewees in her new book said, "I feel that the family has become an idol to the church, and we worship it." And I thought that was very astute. Although an LDS family may be embodied in various ways, the ideal family includes a father who presides, provides, and protects, a mother who nurtures, and of course, children. The Next Mormons reveals that although family size is shrinking among Latter-day Saints in the U.S., it still exceeds the national average. Furthermore, the marriage age is still younger than other Americans and holding steady at 22. The majority of LDS in the U.S. get married young and begin building the ideal family. Leaders of the faith have prescribed distinct roles for men and women within the family. Despite the benefit of the positive theological view of the role of Eve and the belief in a mother in heaven, these distinct roles are often laden with value, and typically women do not fare as well as men. During polygamy, there was obviously some flexibility with marital practices and somewhat with female gender roles, but male headship remained firmly intact. Certain women may have enjoyed more freedom, and women in institutional leadership undoubtedly had more autonomy. With the end of polygamy and the radical institutional growth during the 20th century, correlation brought a narrowing of women's roles within the LDS faith. While women were told to submit to their husbands explicitly during the 19th century, the language of submission began to soften in the 20th century and give way to a softer patriarchal model. The 1995 introduction of the Proclamation of the Family reaffirmed binary gender roles and used both symmetrical and asymmetrical language to describe the ideal marriage relationship. The document employs what Caroline Klein has called dual discourse regarding marital dynamics and gender roles, with the phrase equal partnership used to describe the ideal marriage. At the same time, women are told they are the primary nurturers, and men are assigned the duties to preside, provide, and protect. While the proclamation doesn't specifically link men's presiding role with the priesthood, Klein notes that the male priesthood stands as one of the most emphasized justifications for male leadership in the Mormon home. And I certainly saw this in my ethnographic work as well. Colleen McDaniel points out that the document maintains a silent theology because it does not detail how a father is to preside and a mother is to nurture, nor does it prescribe women's roles beyond nurturing. In this way, she finds the proclamation allows for women to have roles outside of nurturing and for families to create their own meaning of how to live out the ideal family. But how do LDS families live out these roles? What does preside, provide, and nurture actually look like in an LDS family? And do these gender roles shift in different geographical locations? Can I get my water, Nancy? Is that okay? Thanks. Thank you. Okay. So the first ethnography I did in 2006 in North America focused on a population in California. And many of the women I worked with struggled to articulate what it meant to have a patriarch in the home, which is another term that is used for men's roles. The majority, and actually the men really struggled to define what it meant when I interviewed their husbands. The majority of the Latter-day Saints I interviewed believed that the role of men in the home was to set a spiritual example and lead the family in spiritual matters. There was no indication that the women felt that the men were, in fact, more spiritual. In fact, many women expressed a sense of frustration that they end up being the spiritual motivators in the home. Whether they have to remind their husbands about family home evening or call the family together for scripture study, the women I interviewed often felt like they were the spiritual providers even though they do not challenge the rhetoric that their husbands were the spiritual presiders. There were exceptions to this, of course, most notably in converts. Jill, a convert who joined the church several years before her husband, explained how her role as spiritual leader shifted when he joined the church. I feel grateful because now I don't have to sort of carry that on my own. It was for me, okay, let's read the scriptures, let's do family home evening, and now I have a partner again. He was always a partner throughout this process, but on a different level. So I'm grateful that I have someone to lean on spiritually now. The men I interviewed talked about being spiritual leaders within the home. Kent indicated he had thought a lot about what presiding meant, and that he actually found it problematic because it's just setting up too much of a power imbalance. Kent was exceptionally attuned to power dynamics and the subscribed roles, which was rare. In fact, he was the only man who brought up power dynamics on his own. Some men defined presiding as being accountable and making decisions. James articulated his leadership role as one of order. I don't really think it ever works where two people could ultimately be jointly accountable, and I just feel like Heavenly Father has a house of order. When I asked him if this type of accountability was purely spiritual, he said, I think it encompasses everything. One of the things I really like about my relationship with Judy is I feel like it's a total partnership, and we both have different roles to play. You can see that dual discourse peeking through in James's description as well that Klein points out with the proclamation. While most of the women spoke of wanting their husbands to take more of an active role in spiritually presiding, the men didn't necessarily echo that they needed to up their spiritual game during their interviews. In this way, the ideal gender norm of male presiding is often not being realized within some American LDS homes. Instead, it's largely a shared responsibility, with women taking a central role in many cases. So how does providing get employed within the American LDS family? The women I interviewed rarely linked men's roles with providing financially, possibly because many LDS women work outside of the home. But the majority of the men I interviewed took that part of their role very seriously, and it appeared to be their highest priority. In practice, providing appeared to be the men's highest priority, but it was also a shared role. Women's role in the proclamation is to nurture. One of the women I interviewed, Shelby, remarked, I don't know that there's anything stronger except the will to live than the desire to have children and reproduce. Feminist theorists working with a constructionist framework would passionately dispute this, but for many of the women I worked with, motherhood was integral to their sense of self. And when I re-interviewed them in 2013 and asked, one of the questions I asked is, what has changed with your life over the last 9 years? And every single one of them framed it in what had changed in their family life. Whether I'm divorced or I'm widowed or I'm married or I had another child or now I have grandchildren. So it was really interesting to see how central, of course, the family was to their description of how their life had changed in 9 years. American women in the LDS Church take their roles very seriously as nurturers. But this doesn't mean they don't expect their husbands to also parent. In fact, the New Mormon survey found that most young millennial women want an egalitarian marriage, with both partners participating in wage labor and parenting duties. So American LDS families in practice actually share the roles of presider, provider, and nurturer, even though men identify more with providing and women tend to identify as the primary nurturer. This supports the flexibility that McDaniel points out within the proclamation's silent theology. All right, now we're going to look at Botswana and South Africa. Okay, so how does it change, if at all, in the African context? Many women in both South Africa and Botswana are single mothers, and almost every woman works outside of the home, without exception, full-time, hard work. In both countries, the women express concerns about domineering men and the dynamics of marriage that are often marked by female sacrifice and subordination. And I really want to caution not to use a colonial lens when we're looking at these cases. I felt like the African women were more open and real, where I my participant observation observed a lot of domination and subordination in the American LDS families as well. It was definitely more hidden, and it was not talked about. The women in Africa were more explicit about it. So I just want to make sure we're not othering these women as somehow perpetual victims of their husbands, where in fact patriarchy brings subordination in all sorts of geographic locales. Okay, so due to the historical shifts leading to mass migration of many men in Botswana, Botswana women became educated and independent over the last several generations, and marriage became less of a cultural expectation. Coupled with lobola, or bride wealth, where the groom pays the bride's family as a symbol of connectedness of the family and a celebration of fertility, many men must save for years in order to properly ritualize both the engagement and the marriage. And I'm looking at one of my fellow researchers, we had an experience where we were able to talk to a man, Charles, was he from Botswana? And he told us firsthand about how difficult that was to have that financial burden, and yet culturally it's so important. So a workaround culturally for this is to start a family before you can afford the marriage. And Charles did this. They had 3 children while he was still trying to save for the marriage. Thus, a shortage of men and the expense of lobola have led to a devaluation of getting married before starting a family within Setswana culture. And within the LDS community, these challenges persist. Gender dynamics in South Africa have been influenced by conflict, as apartheid and post-apartheid violence have crippled the economy and left many men to find work outside of the country. Families struggle to pick up the pieces after years of national conflict, and scholars have noted that when conflict ends nationally, it typically recedes into the domestic sphere. As all of that violence and anger, it has to go somewhere. So we see a lot of domestic abuse and sexual assault within the home at that point. And again, this is not unlike the relationships we see in the United States, where sexual assault and rape culture is at an all-time high. So, well, I shouldn't say all-time high. It is very prevalent. I need to fact check that. Almost every married LDS woman in both countries expressed relief at the way that LDS teachings on gender roles have helped their husbands to be less domineering, more emotionally connected, and active participants in family life. These women find the ideal LDS family construct to actually be very liberating. They see their husbands transforming into soft patriarchs. While men are becoming less domineering when they adopt LDS gender norms, they aren't necessarily the main presiders within the home. Presiding spiritually was done by some of the men we found in these countries, but like their American counterparts, African LDS men are typically the true spiritual leaders within the home. Of course, like in the US, not all LDS women in Africa are married. In fact, among the women we interviewed in Botswana, over 30% were single mothers. Motherhood is an incredibly important role in Botswana, and young women are encouraged by relatives to become pregnant, even outside of marriage, since a woman's value is directly tied to her ability to have children. LDS women who are unmarried and childless also feel this pressure, even from their fellow LDS relatives. Klein has noted that Botswana culture valorizes motherhood but constructs it very differently than Western LDS leaders have prescribed. In Botswana, motherhood is associated with productive labor, and a woman's primary responsibility as a mother is to provide economically for her child, even if this means having a relative do the day-to-day nurturing and raising of her children. So this is a deep sacrifice for many women in Botswana, and women who become mothers often participate in what's called child fosterage, where a relative raises their child on their behalf while they are providing financial support. During several of our interviews, I was struck by a subtle but apparent a narrative of loss that was coming through for a lot of these women. Now, the women who were actually leaving their child with relatives to raise, they weren't necessarily speaking of regret, but the adult women who had been left as children to be raised by relatives would talk in terms of loss, but then quickly reframe that that was for our benefit, and I was young and I didn't understand. But like us all, they longed for their mothers, and of course, ultimately understood it was for their benefit. Women in South Africa have also had to make sacrifices in order to be mothers and provide for their children. Tina discussed her childhood. So I would see my mom in a month, maybe I would see her twice. And whenever I would go back, or I would have to go back, I would start crying. Why do I have to leave? I want to be with you. At that time, I couldn't understand because I was young. This anecdote was not atypical, as women describe being raised by female relatives because their mothers were working to support them. Even when women can provide and nurture their children, it's a serious struggle. So even the women who kept their children in the home with them. Donna noted, I was single-handed to support the family, and that was not easy. Many women are either not able to perform the primary role as nurturers because they are fulfilling the role of providers, or they struggle financially and rely on relatives for assistance. Donna continues, I looked after my family tons of times. When there was a noise outside, I was the first to go outside because there was nobody else. And I didn't have a gun to confront those people and think apartheid culture. I mean, needing a gun would be a very real thing. It was just me. Yes, and I provided and presided perfectly. So Donna brings up protecting her family as well. And in this way, she embodies every explicit role for both males and females within the proclamation. Women who are married don't necessarily have a partner who helps to nurture the children. And Bell observed, because someone, like even when we're in church, for example, if a child cries, it's rare for a man to stand up and take the child outside. You're the one who has to do everything, cooking, cleaning, even working. And I see this plenty too. So again, this can be a universal experience. Belle expected more from her husband. She continues, we have teachings that say men need to do this. They need to help their wives. We have to change a nappy. We have to take a child to bathe them, But me, I say, I expect him to help me. Nurturing is primarily a female role, but LDS gender norms are actually encouraging African men to help in this responsibility. So in Botswana and South Africa, LDS women are often the spiritual presiders, and they also are typically the main providers. These women are not necessarily the primary nurturers of their own children, however, but rely on other women to help raise them. In this way, nurturing is still largely a female role within the society, but family is seen as much larger and extended. Despite prescribed gender roles that are distinct within the proclamation, it appears that in all three countries, women are often the spiritual drivers within their families, making them the actual presiders in many cases, and co-presiders at the very least. What is unique within the African context is that women feel grateful for the softer patriarchal practices that their husbands adopt when they embody LDS gender norms. Providing for the family is a shared duty in American LDS homes, but women are rarely the primary providers. The LDS women in Botswana and South Africa are often the sole or majority providers for their families. For them, providing financially sometimes means they have to forgo their role as primary nurturers. Nurturing is primarily a female role in all three countries. However, it is more exclusively a female activity in Botswana and South Africa. Sometimes men help with child rearing, but the norm is that female relatives take over as primary nurturers when fathers are absent and mothers cannot both nurture and provide. African LDS women express gratitude, as we talked about, that men are becoming more involved because of the LDS gender norms. And they're helping to actively raise children when they are within a marriage. But this wasn't the majority of the women who spoke of this. American LDS women typically expect that their husbands will participate in parenting and be present in family life, and younger generations are certainly expressing this. Compared to other Christian traditions, Latter-day Saint theology lends itself to placing women and men in a more symmetrical relationship with the silent theology within the proclamation. It appears that American and African Latter-day Saint women are finding ways to use the proclamation in order to realize these opportunities for symmetry while grappling with the realities of less than ideal circumstances. Thank you.
We have some time for questions, so let's have people people stand up. I don't know if we still have the microphone. Maybe we needed to just shift a little bit first, right? I'm sure we have questions, right? Go ahead.
So, this is to Amy. Did the men describe the role of providing differently in California than they did in Africa and South Africa?
Say it again. Because
So, did the men that you talked to in South Africa and Botswana describe the role of presiding and providing differently than the men did in North America?
So one of the challenges of combining my earlier ethnographic work, can you hear me okay? Just kidding. Is that I had included men in my original ethnographic work in North America. And when we worked as a team, we strictly interviewed women. Our insight into Lobola in Botswana was actually our safari guide, Charles, because we took a 3-day safari because we needed a break. And so that was not an official interview, but that is definitely one of the things that we would love to do to move forward, is to also interview men so we can compare what's actually distinct. Yeah, great question.
Thanks. Sorry. Okay, my question is for you, Nancy. In my experience with the temple changes, I went 4 times probably in the first 10 days or whatever, and was thrilled with what felt like progress until I went to a sealing, and then I felt like it was a bait and switch with the added presiding. I felt like it was doubled down. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't have any comment on that. I've just focused on the law of obedience covenant in the endowment, just because the Mormon feminist community has spent so much time discussing hearken and obey language. So I haven't done a study on that. I have not. I don't consider myself to be LDS anymore, so I don't have firsthand experience of the sealing change. But I would say that what you are describing does sound consistent with the change that was made in the endowment with regards to the law of obedience.
I have a question for Nancy. I was really confused when I heard, I'd seen the things on Facebook and friends had texted me, mainly because a lot of my friends knew that I had stopped veiling about 1.5 years before the changes. I had just decided I wasn't going to do it anymore. But it's so confusing to me that if these changes were because women were having pain in the temple, then I would think they would want people to know about them so that they would come back. You know, like I wanted to shout it off the rooftops so that people could maybe give it another try, but it didn't seem like that, and it just left me really kind of confused. So your thoughts on that?
Well, and so what I spoke today was part of a slightly longer study, and we Jessica and I did a survey of Mormons in their garments a few years ago where we got 4,500 responses. And if I had had more time, I think one of the things I would have said is that a lot of people seemed really confused about their covenants and what they were actually covenanting to and what that meant. And so I think confusion is emerging to me as a researcher as a theme that is connected to the temple, which is unsettling. So yeah.
So I have a question for Jana. I would love to hear more of your findings concerning the age disparities between women specifically. So the younger women, what specific areas did you see where their belief and also behaviors were diverging from older women?
Great question. Also, I wanted to apologize to all of you. I thought we only had 15 minutes to speak and we were ending at 2, and so I was trying to rush through. So sorry about that. I didn't want to be that first speaker who takes up all the time and then, sorry. So questions about generational difference among Mormon women. We saw quite a few interesting generational changes, including one that I've written about for Religion News Service, which is that a majority of younger Mormon women say that they are troubled at least a little bit by women not holding the priesthood. And a strong majority of older women say they are not at all troubled by that. And as Amy mentioned, we also saw some differences in the kinds of marriages that they believe would be ideal. So that's a little bit different. Education is growing. That was interesting too. So the percentage of Generation X women who had completed college was a nice increase over the boomer silent women who had completed college. In terms of theological orthodoxy, I don't think the differences were that tremendous. Women in general are more theologically orthodox. But politics also is a big change, and that's for millennials in general. Millennial Latter-day Saints in general are more likely to be, less likely to be Republican, let's put it that way. And a little bit more, we had 46% of the millennial sample who claim a Republican identity, 41% a Democratic identity, and 13% independent, which is a pretty significant political change from older Mormons.
This question is for Amy. So the women that you spoke with and worked with in Africa, I wanted to get a sense for when they hear the more traditional rhetoric about strict gender roles and women nurture, etc. How do they deal with that? Do they feel like they are fulfilling that, or do they feel like, oh, well, that doesn't really apply to our lifestyle here because it's different here?
That's interesting. We interviewed as a team, and so when we transcribed the interviews, I wasn't looking exactly for if that's interesting. I didn't see it. Let me put it that way. But I can't say definitively because I've got other researchers, but I want to ask them about that. But I think my sense is, and maybe Heather, you could chime in on this, my sense is that they felt like they were fulfilling their nurturing role, even if they had to participate in child fosterage. Because as a community, it's a genealogical line of women who are embracing this child. So the communal effort of raising children, it wouldn't necessarily be a disconnect for them to think, oh, I'm failing at nurturing, because they are making sure the child is nurtured. They're maybe just not living with them. What do you think, Heather?
Yeah, I would say that everyone I spoke to loved the proclamation on the family, found it very liberating in a way that was baffling to me, but they didn't bring what I brought to it. So they would be working full time and their mom or sister or aunt would be taking care of their kids. They saw zero contradiction.
I was in a leadership meeting 20 years ago or something, as Amy was speaking. It came to mind, the presenter said that the church had done a study, and if they put really emphasis on young men, young women, they could get attendance up, young men and young women. If they put it on Relief Society, they could get Relief Society attendance up. But if they put it on Melchizedek priesthood, all of them went up. All the statistics got better. And I think that's what I was hearing. If the men were being involved, everyone was better. And I guess my question is for Jana. Do you think that same statistic would hold true based on your studies?
That is I'm trying to think of a very nice way to put this. That is a very popular theory in patriarchal religion. And it is also heard in evangelical circles. And in fact, I gave a rather nasty blog review recently to a book by James Emery White, who is an evangelical pastor, who said in his book that he specifically targets fathers because his view was that if you can get the fathers to come back to church, then you can get the entire family to come back to church. Statistically, no, that doesn't really hold true, particularly right now, because we are in a situation where, for the first time that I'm aware of, the young women are catching up to young men in terms of disaffiliation. And that's a very interesting pattern. We've taken women and girls for granted for a long time, that they would be what I just showed you that they are, 9 points more religious, etc., more, behaviorally orthodox as well. What you've said, though, is fascinating to me, because I'm working on a thing with Matt Bowman, who discovered in the papers of Harold B. Lee the results of a 1972, possibly 1971 church study of its members. And the thing that strikes me most is how much emphasis there is on active involvement of fathers. So it's clear that that belief is there, that the church believes that if we can get fathers to, at least at that time, if we could get fathers back to church, then everyone else will fall in line. I don't think that that holds water anymore.
Are you saying that then women are catching up to men?
In terms of disaffiliation?
9% is going to strengthen as they get down to.
Well, this is a good question. We didn't really think or talk about the why of religion being more, women being more active religiously. And this is particularly true for conservative religious women. So for evangelical women, for Orthodox Jewish women, Mormon women. And what is it that women are receiving in those contexts that they don't receive necessarily from the outside world? And that's a very important question to ask. Women who, for example, choose to stay home with their children. One of my interviewees who had trained for a profession but then decided to stay home with her children for a time and eventually go back to work, said that she appreciated church more for, in this reason. For the first time, the church's emphasis on the family, because it was one of the only places in her life where she was experiencing validation for her decision to stay home for that period.
Can I respond really quick? Thanks. I just wanted to say that indeed the African women want their male partners, their husbands, to be involved. They want them to provide financially. They want them to help nurture. But they are definitely still spiritually leading the home. And I don't know if their spiritual statistics would increase by men being involved. I feel like there's all sorts of challenges when the men are involved. It's not ideal, but just to be clear, it's really complex, and they long for that financial help so that they can nurture, and the less domineering and the more benevolent patriarchal relationships, if you will.
This question is for Jana. Jana, did your research break the questions down by race? And, so I need to read the book to see all of that. or will there be a follow-up book that focuses more on the racial breakdown?
So in that 1,156 people, we had a small number. And I emphasize that because the findings in the chapter on minority Latter-day Saints and racial attitudes in the church's history, the findings are quite provisional. And I would want to, I try to say this several times. We treat the statistics for all persons of color, which is problematic in itself.
It is.
In many places. And then there are a couple of places where we also break them down by racial group. We only had 50 African Americans in the survey. We had 50 Hispanic Americans in the survey, and even smaller numbers of Pacific Islanders, Native Americans, and Asian Americans. So isolating racial groups leads to a very high margin of error. So that's all by way of saying there were some really interesting differences that we, I wrote about in that chapter, and I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Okay. Do you have any plans to try to do maybe an additional study that focuses more on the racial differences?
We definitely have a plan for an additional study down the road where we would be involving Generation Z now that they're reaching an adulthood and can take surveys without their parents' permission. Yay! But no plans specifically to only do this population of Mormons of color in the United States. I think that would be really interesting because so far the studies that have been done are very small scale,
right,
kind of localized. And I do reference some of that research in the chapter. Our research actually confirmed quite a lot of what they had found in these smaller studies, but it's still it's such a nascent thing. It needs more research. It's very expensive to do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Jana, I was just wondering if the results you gave were uniform across the United States, or were you able to break them down regionally? Are there any differences at all?
You will not be shocked to know Utah Mormons are more religious than the rest of us who don't live here. So we did a state by state, and that was the highest level of geographical determination. I had the option of doing this by zip code, which would have been very interesting. And if you, for example, wanted to compare by zip code Mormons in Salt Lake City versus Mormons who live here in Provo, that would be very interesting. And decided against that because the anonymity, the absolute anonymity of our respondents is so important to me. And a sociologist said, well, there is this hypothetical scenario in which you have, we know everything about these people. We know their sexual history, how long they've been in the church. So if you have a convert African-American Mormon male living in the state of Maine, okay, he's probably the only guy. The chances are that maybe when we release this data set, someone's going to know all about his sex life, right? Totally unacceptable. So if there's even the tiniest, most remote possibility that someone's anonymity would be compromised, that's not acceptable. So we can only do it state by state. But having said that, there are some really interesting differences between Utah Mormons and Mormons outside. Partly that is the factor of convert status. Here in Utah, converts are much rarer than they are outside of Utah, and converts are actually not as orthodox and behaviorally keeping all the norms as Utah Mormons tend to be. So it was interesting.
What direction did those differences go? For example, back east on the East Coast, or California, do you see the stark differences?
No. So in other areas of the United States, that would be interesting. Then you also, though, run into the question of margin of error going so far that it might not be statistically useful anymore.
Hi, I have a question for Jana and for Amy. I was wondering if you examined in your interviews or in your statistics the role of pornography in the family and how it affected women's trust in men, whether that made them less likely to marry, or how it affected the trust within the family and the role of men's leadership in the family.
You answer first, because I'm going to.
Sorry, yes.
So within this study, I did not, but I do a lot of work in the anti-porn movement. Since 89% of pornography is now depicting violence against women, at least according, 89% of pornography that is viewed online in the United States, at least, according to Gail Dines, she's a professor who studies sexuality and gender. These images are depicting violence against women, and we are seeing an uptick in violent sexual behavior. So I do a lot of work in that area. So this wasn't included in this study. I will say that South Africa, I know, has extremely high rates of violent pornography consumption, so much so that it's bleeding into all sorts of different realms. And anecdotally on airplanes and so forth, I've talked to women who are grappling with that in South Africa. They didn't sign consent. I didn't do formal interviews, but so just statistically, you can go to Pornhub and you can look up. There's also a trade newsletter for all of the porn industry, and it shows you statistics. For instance, 30% of porn viewers are now female, and it's rising. There's all sorts of information out there broken down by country as well. So I would love to do more research on it.
My question is for Amy as well.
Wait,
so sorry.
Sorry. I just looked up these statistics. I can't have that go to waste. Okay. You asked about how many people are using pornography, and I don't have any qualitative data on how it affects relationships. That's a very good question. I can't answer that, but at least can tell you the rates for viewing pornography among all Mormons in the NMS increases from about 1 in 20 in the older generations to just under 1 in 5 among millennials. And when you break that down by gender, the rate more than doubles among men who are in the boomer silent generations, 10%, to the millennials, 22%. Among women, the generational spread is even more pronounced. Only a tiny number of boomer silent women have viewed explicit porn recently, 1.5%, while 15% of millennial women have, a tenfold increase from the oldest Mormon women to the youngest. Although 15% is a small minority, it's not radically smaller than the number for millennial men, 22%, which means that Mormon leaders' discourse about pornography as a temptation only for men seems misguided.
Sorry about that. Question for you, Amy. In your research, you mentioned that women had the desire for men to up their spiritual game in regards to presiding. Yet, according to Jana's research, women seem to be far more qualified at leading, with higher performances across the board in spirituality. So my question is, why do women not want to assume the leadership position? And when they do, why do they view it as a burden instead of an opportunity?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot. Thank you for the question. I've been thinking a lot about that. I think it's a really missed opportunity within the church. We have people with talent and knowledge and resources and women who are saying, I am more than a mother. I want other roles institutionally and within the home. And this would be a really great opportunity to widen those available roles. I suspect that, no, I don't really want to speculate. I don't know. I know for myself, so I can speak anecdotally about myself. I think I worry about taking that from my husband, and he is fairly decent at calling for, all the stuff. But like the other night, I said, it's time to eat. We've got 5 kids. I'm like, half of you are sitting. Someone say a prayer. Quick, before we have to go on to the new program that we do during dinner in 5 minutes. So and Kevin was on his phone, and he's just doing something. And again, I have an awesome partner. So this anecdote shouldn't be widely assumed that represents who he is as a person. And the kids are already eating and they're ignoring me. I'm like, we need a prayer. And he's like, all of a sudden, Kevin just folds his arms and starts praying. And I'm like, dude, like I was on it, I had actually called on my son Cooper, and it was like, but then Kevin took it over because that's his role. And instead of calling on someone, and I just was like, this is so lame. What, So I don't know, but I just know that there's definitely a disconnect there, and I would love to see it addressed.
We probably have time for one more question, if anybody has it.
So Jana, yesterday listening to NPR with my child in the car, so I'm not sure if I understood it completely. You said the number one reason why women are distancing themselves or leaving the church was because of a sense of feeling judged. Was that generational? And what do you feel, or from the survey or studies, is that tied to?
So among the former Mormon population, this is the 540 people who no longer identify as Latter-day Saint. The number one reason for women in leaving the church was, I felt judged or misunderstood. That also tied for number one among all millennials, both men and women. So younger women in particular, that is a very resonant experience. The second part of your question, I think, was more qualitative, and I don't know is the answer. We really can't answer that part from a survey. What does it feel like to them to be judged or misunderstood, or what happened? But that is their feeling, and that is something that seems to have been enough to drive many out of the church.
Let's thank the panel.